Okay, so roses. How many people here grow roses? How many people don't grow roses? That would be easier. Yeah, how many people of those, I mean, in Palm Springs and the valley, Coachella Valley, you have loads of people who have moved there from, the Northwest or from the East Coast, and growing roses down here in Southern California is so totally different. And for them, it's a big learning experience. It was for me. And I'm going to guess that probably for most of you, this may be old hat and very familiar, and you may not learn very much, and I'm sorry. But some of you might learn something, and maybe I'll learn something, and that's always fun for me. So here are these are roses. These are all hybrid tea roses, and I'll be talking about the different types of roses and what they're good for. But one of the amazing things to me about roses is that there are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of hybridized roses. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a family of plants that cover a broader range of colors. All the jewel tones have such a unique and wonderful smell, and are long-lived and readily available. So those are some of the reasons why most of us grow roses. They're also a great source of cut flowers, and the varieties range from shrub roses to climbers and everything in between. However, roses take a huge amount of water. They require a lot of fertilizer. Hybrid tea roses in particular need a lot of annual attention, as do some of the other similar plants like grandifloras and floribundas. And going back to the issue of dangerous plants, most roses have serious thorns. And we've heard an example of the danger of getting a rose thorn in your hand. Generalities, as I say, they tend to be heavy eaters and drinkers. They typically like full sun, but particularly in the desert, they do benefit from some afternoon shade. Major enemies, for those of you who may have come from the East Coast or from the Northwest, major enemies of roses are the fungus black spot, which is very aptly named given what it looks like on a leaf, and it will essentially take a beautiful rose bush and turn it into twigs in no time at all. And beetles also. On the East Coast, Japanese beetles were a scourge of rose growers. Here, beetles, at least in the valley, in the Coachella Valley, beetles are not nearly as problematic. We do get some beetles. They seem to prefer light-colored white roses compared to other colors. Don't know why. So types of roses, floribundas, hybrid teas, grandifloras, shrub roses, climbers, and rose species, species roses, wild roses. And we'll go through all the different classes. When most people think of a classic rose that comes from the florist, they're thinking about a hybrid tea rose. The hybrid teas produce a single flower on nice long stems, so they're great for cutting. They produce several flower flushes, major ones being in the fall and the spring, but they'll keep blooming throughout the intervening months. From March through November, or December, you can have flowers. It's just that in the summertime, the flowers are much smaller in size, and they typically don't last very long. Generally, hybrid teas have been grafted onto a hardy rootstock, And so it's important when you're planting them to plant the graft above the dirt level. Hybrid tea roses require significant annual pruning, which can be a frightening thing for someone who comes from the East Coast. And I have a whole series of pictures to show you the proper way of pruning your hybrid tea roses. Bushes are readily available in local nurseries, and you can either buy bare-rooted roses through the mail or at many times at a nursery, or you can get them that are sort of pre-planted in cardboard boxes that will break down over time. That said, whenever I get a rose and it comes in one of these biodegradable containers, I always make a lot of holes in the side of the container to make it easier for the roots to escape and get into the garden soil. And in case you're the competitive sort and like to enter competitions, you want to focus on roses having lots of petals. These apparently are one of the factors that judges are often looking for in judging roses. That said, I was a little surprised to see, apparently, by Googling, that the Riverside Rose Society has ceased to exist, which is a shame because rose societies are usually good ways to get information on how to grow roses in your local climate and what roses do well in your area, that sort of thing. Yes, ma'am? Raincross Society has taken the place. And where is Raincross? The city of Riverside. Yeah. Oh, okay. It's called Raincross instead of the Riverside Rose Society. Good to know. And I bet that they have a web page, and I bet they have monthly meetings and judging and all those good things. Okay. Excellent. Good deal. So here are some examples of some hybrid tea roses. Some classics. All of these were in my garden, and I love all of them. I require that roses look nice, that they smell great, that they are prolific producers, and those are the only requirements. Floribundas, the next category. Floribundas are similar to hybrid teas, except that they produce multiple flowers on each stem. The stems typically are not as long, so they're probably somewhat better suited to outdoor growth and being enjoyed in the garden, and somewhat less useful as cut flowers. They tend to flower more freely than the hybrid teas. If you have multiple plants, you can use them as a hedge. And if you grow the individual plants, they should be pruned in the same way as the hybrid tea rose. Yes, ma'am?
Is a Banks rose, is that considered a rose?
A Banks rose?
Look, big bushy climber.
Oh, it's a climber.
Climbs 30 or 40,
Okay.
You've never heard of it then?
I've never heard of that variety, but I have several climbers, and we'll get to climbers.
It's an old rose, it only blooms once in the spring.
It's an old rose that only blooms once in the spring.
It does grow about 30 feet.
One more fascinating fact for that type of rose. The largest rose in the world in Tombstone is a Ladybank's rose.
Yeah. What's a Banks rose?
It's like a square block.
Okay, so the Lady Banks rose has, if you're into size, apparently it's the tallest one, so you have some bragging rights there. If it only blooms once, in the spring, I mean, gosh, that's a lot of real estate to give up for.
It covers a chain link fence, usually don't.
Oh, okay. If you want your chain link fence to disappear, and there's good reason for that, this is the rose for you. And yeah, well, I was going to get to that. Climbing roses are terrific against walls and fences because no one or no thing is going to try to get over that wall. They are evil plants. Okay, examples of floribundas. Grandifloras. Grandiflora is a category I had never heard of and really didn't know what it was. It's sort of a cross between a hybrid tea and a floribunda. They have multiple flowers on a stem. They have shorter stems than hybrid teas. So they're a lot like a floribunda. Except they're floribundas on steroids. I don't think I have any grandifloras. There are some roses that are produced in multiple forms. So you can have a rose that is a hybrid tea, and you can have essentially the same rose that's a climber, for example. I think Mr. Lincoln would be an example of a red rose that's both a hybrid tea and a climber. Shrub roses or landscape roses, low growers. They're often bush-like. A nice thing is that they have very few thorns. You don't have to deadhead them to produce more flowers. They really grow, in my garden, they grow all year round and flower all year round. They still want water and fertilizer, however, but they don't also need very much pruning. Here are some shrub roses, and for comparison, you have two 18-pound Shelties, so you get some idea of the size. The picture at the bottom right gives you a nice idea of the color and the shape of some of the flowers. The flowers are far smaller than hybrid tea, but they're very nice just to have in the garden for landscaping. Climbers, these are wonderful background plants. They can be 15 to 20 feet long, generally don't require heavy pruning, have horrible, horrible thorns. I mean, they are terrible, nasty creatures. Flowers are smaller than hybrid teas, and they do require water and fertilizer. They don't require much in the way of pruning. I find that after a while the canes get really long and they get a bit sparse down at the bottom, and so pruning them back will stimulate some new growth and make the plant look a little bit nicer. So here's a climber up against a brick wall. Yeah.
I've never been clear on this. Where do they categorize the David Austin roses?
The David Austin roses, I think, are all hybrid teas. I think so. I think they're hybrid teas. And I don't grow them. I guess my sense is, okay, these have all been hybridized in England. Palm Springs and London climates are a little different, and so I just don't believe that they'll do very well.
They do really well in Tampa, I will tell you that.
Okay.
Particularly if you choose the correct one.
Okay, if you choose the correct David Austin, and David Austin, by the way, is a hybridizer / grower of roses. There are many, many such, but this is a very famous, well-known one. And if I think of a David Austin rose, I'm thinking about one that has huge numbers of petals and a wonderful smell. Yeah, yeah. Well, check it out. I mean, you can look online at David Austin roses and see what it is. Yes?
A climber. I know roofs like sun, but I'm afraid to have anything climb up a wall out here because of the heat. Am I going to have a crooked climber?
Well, one thing to know is that the climbers don't actually grab onto the wall.
Right, yeah,
Okay.
I know you have to, yeah. But I mean, can they handle the heat from a
Yeah.
wall that gets full sun?
Well, I have a masonry wall. It's not chain link, but it gets hot in the desert, and they're fine. They're fine. They may need more water, Yes, ma'am.
Do you need a trellis to get started?
I've never used a trellis to start them.
So the cane's strong enough that they just.
Yeah, the canes are really strong, and sometimes what I've done is to use wire, put a couple nails into the wall and wire, and just to train it up against the wall so it doesn't intrude too far into the garden.
Don't the roses bloom on old wood, on a climber, and on new wood, on a teak? Is that the reason you don't prune the climber as hard?
Well, actually, what happens with my climbers, right, is you have these old canes, and you have new growth coming off the old canes, and the flowers come off that new growth. So species roses, I think this is the last category. These are wild roses. They're very often single petal roses, very few petals. They're kind of sweet. They very often don't have any smell. They have a limited range of colors. I mean, they haven't been hybridized for all these desirable traits. But here are some examples, and they're lovely. So how to plant roses. Things are changing, by the way. But planting the soil with lots of organic material, amending it so that the soil will hold moisture, using lots of compost, for example. When planting the pre-potted roses, I make holes in the container to facilitate the spread of the roots. And the graft point the bump should be above the soil level. I'm going to skip this for a minute. And this is what I use as my annual schedule. January, this was so hard for me to do, coming from the East Coast. But in January, you strip all of the leaves off the rose, and you prune it back to about, each of the canes back to about a ½ inch above an outward-facing leaf scar. And I'll show you on the next slides what that looks like. And so your rose bush may go in this process from 4 feet or 5 feet tall to like 1.5 feet. And you reduce the number of canes down to about 4 to 6 nice sturdy canes, preferably ones that face outward so you don't have lots of crisscrossing canes ultimately. In February, I give them each a tablespoon of Epsom salts, which is a great source of magnesium. And if you like, after you put their feet into some Epsom salts, you can put some into a little tub and put your own feet in there and let your feet soften up. March through summer, I'm fertilizing the roses fairly frequently in small doses, because we are doing a lot of irrigating, and so the nutrients are going to be driven down deep in the soil, out of the root zone. In the fall, a light trim to clean up the bushes, eliminate small diameter twigs. I stopped fertilizing in November to allow the plants to start going dormant. And December, you can start checking rose catalogs for new orders. In actual fact, there have been changes, and I have a neighbor who prunes his roses back the 1st of November. And I thought he was nuts, because I still have all these wonderful flowers coming out. But then he gets the spring flush of roses much, much earlier. And so what I did this year as an experiment is I took half my hybrid tea roses, and I pruned them back in the 1st of November, and then I took the other half and I waited until it was either late December or the first week of January. And that way I got the best of both worlds. The ones that got pruned back first are also blooming earlier, and the later ones were giving me flowers back in November, December, and they're perking along, and they'll be having flowers soon. So that's a an experiment worth trying yourself. Um, when you harvest roses, hybrid tea roses to bring in, first of all, cutting the rose bush stimulates new growth. You cut the stem a ½ inch above a leaf with 5 leaflets. Cut back the stem sufficiently so that the new growth can support the next rose. And you know, I was always disappointed by how short the roses lasted after I brought them in. I used to do, yeah, I'm a scientist. I used to do experiments with sugar and with aspirin and sugar and aspirin. And I ultimately decided that the way to go is to spend the big bucks and go on the web and buy like 100 packets of that florist powder. And the reason is that I also tried bleach for a while. The bleach is good because it knocks out bacteria, which is a bigger problem. The sugar gives the stem a little bit of nutrition to keep it going. But the thing that I really couldn't control as easily was the pH of the water. And roses really like a acidic solution. And it's the same thing in our soil. Our soil is very basic, and that's really not the best for roses. So this year I also started playing around with adding some iron sulfate to the roses to lower the pH. That said, as a toxicologist, know that iron is toxic. It's also a essential element, but in large doses or larger doses, it is also toxic. So if you're putting it in the ground, what you want to do is to dig it in so your pets or kids can't get at it. Selecting roses, it's too late for this year, pretty much. Your local nursery probably has a list of rose bushes that do well here. They probably stock them in January. The local Rose Society would have the same material. You can also check out the catalogs for the major rose growers. And what's nice about that, and here are the names of several of them, what's nice about that is that you can see an information sheet like this, the name of the rose, you know, its color, its fragrance, you know, how many petals it has, if you're really obsessive like I am about that sort of thing, the height, you know, all these things, and also whether it won any awards. There is an annual awarding of roses, of medals to roses by the American Rose Society, and it's always a winner to, it's always appropriate, a good idea to get a winner. But there are many other ways of choosing your roses. I mean, one of the possibilities, for example, would be, you know, to get a Rosemary Clooney and a Barbra Streisand and have a you know, have a whole chorus going on in your backyard. Or you could have presidents or presidents' wives, you know, and you could order them by whether Democrats or Republicans, whatever. You know, there are lots of different strategies, or you can just go for things you like. So the American Rose Society selections are based on hardiness, appearance, scent, things of those sorts. And this is more relevant to the Desert Rose Society and Palm Desert, but you probably have exactly the same information. How to prune your hybrid tea. Okay, this is a picture beforehand. This rose is probably about 4 feet tall. That's after I got done decimating it. And a couple of things that are wrong about this is that at this point I've left too many canes on the surviving plant. I should wind up with 4 to 6 and picking the nice big ones that face outward. If I have old wood that looks dead, I take a little saw and I cut it away because it's not going to generate anything of any value. And it's kind of ugly. One of the other things that I haven't done in this photograph is I haven't cleaned up all the debris, all those leaves underneath the plant, which are a great source of infection, which you don't want. Okay, leaf scars. That would be a leaf scar. And so you would prune the rose a ½ inch above that. And some people, places will recommend that you cut on an angle. And the rationale being that you don't want moisture to get onto the cut end and possibly lead to growth of fungus or infection. I guess my sense is that our climates are so dry that the risk of that is really small. And so for habit, I do that. But I don't know that it's really critical. And it's absolutely not critical to put Elmer's glue on the cut end. That's really not needed. So don't forget to clean up the debris. What about plants to have near your roses? I put a plumeria in the middle of my rose garden because they have relatively low water needs. They have nice big leaves that provide some shade to the shorter roses. Another classic is planting lavender in front of the roses. I mean, we all know that ultimately rose bushes get pretty bald at the bottom, and it's sort of nice to be able to hide that, and lavender can be a good way to do it. Some examples of roses I think are real winners. Double Delight, which has a great smell and was a Rose Society winner. Midas Touch, which is a nice dark yellow. Just Joey, which changes color as it opens, and very prolific and a great smell. Mr. Lincoln is a classic red, dark red. Peace Rose was hybridized during World War II, and interestingly, cuttings of it were sent to all the countries that sent representatives to the first United Nations meeting, and that's how it got the moniker, the Peace Rose. It's an old rose, and its form is not as good as that of many of the newer roses I have, but it has a great story, so I have it. Barbara Streisand, what can I say? Plum roses, plum and peach roses in the desert don't thrive in the heat, and I bet the same thing is true up here. If you need Barbara Streisand in your life, put it in a shadier spot. An update. There was a really interesting article in the LA Times a couple of months ago on changes in agrarian at the Huntington Garden. And it relates to the fact that our climate is, our climate is changing, and roses are having a tough go at it. And so what Huntington is recommending, which is like heresy, is that we use spraying water rather than drip irrigation on our roses. And the notion is that, again, our climate here is so hot and dry that you're not going to have a lot of moisture on your leaves, so you're not going to have a lot of black spot. And their rationale is that this will cool down the plant in the summertime and wash off the dust. Now, this is a Huntington Garden. It's not a piece of desert craziness. It's Inland Empire craziness. The other, well, yeah, I mean, twice a week for 20 minutes is what they're doing at Huntington Garden. I don't know how much water their sprayers are putting out, and they can afford it, I suspect. And the other thing they're recommending is using coarse wood bark mulch, 3 to 4 inch coarse wood bark mulch to keep the roots cool. And they're also saying that, unfortunately, at the end of the season, you need to remove the mulch. So, which, you know, it's a lot of work, a lot of work. So I haven't done these things yet, and I'm debating. I'm really having a hard time with the idea of spraying the roses with water, because with all of the wet weather we've had in the desert, you know, there is a little bit of black spot on some of the leaves of my roses. So if it's that way now, when we're, you know, bone dry, aside from yesterday, I can't imagine what it would look like, you know, later on in the season. So I think I'll still use bubblers, but I really will be mulching heavily to keep the roots cool. And also, I've discovered we do go away for good part of the summer. You know, when it gets up to 125, we don't feel a great need to stay in town. And so before we left, last 2 years, I've put shade cloth over the roses. It doesn't look pretty, but we also don't lose any roses. We did 3 years ago. We lost several. So I think that's all I have to say about roses. If any of you want to look at this article from the Huntington Garden, you know, I'll hang out for a few minutes, and you're welcome to look at it. Yeah. What about miniature roses? Good point. Miniature roses are small, and they produce lots of little flowers, many of the same colors that you'll see in a hybrid tea. I've taken miniatures, and after they've bloomed, I've put them out in the garden, and they're very happy and live on and on and on.
Pruning and all that kind of.
In terms of pruning, I don't have a good answer for that. David, do you?
I have about 100 miniature roses, and it often depends on the growth habit of the particular plant. The term miniature rose is reflective of the size of the rose and not necessarily the plant. I have some miniatures that are climbers that are at least 8 feet long, and I have others that are little micro minis that are only about 6 inches tall, even when they're big. So the pruning practice really depends on the growth habit. So if it's a plant that really wants to grow bigger, then you're going to leave a lot more growth on it. If it's a micro mini, then you're going to cut it back a lot more because it's on that new growth that it's going to produce some of the flowers. So as a 2-second lesson on pruning miniatures, feel free to give me a call. My wife has put on some presentations on miniature roses, and she has a PowerPoint that she is doing a couple of years ago.
Yes.
At UCR Botanic Garden, they had us, their rose, I think, got up to about 3 feet, and we pruned down to 6 inches off the ground, so the leaves and took out extra things.
Good. January. So that's great. We do that in the desert also. We typically take a bunch of trainees and veteran master gardeners out to one of the parks in one of the towns, and we'll do trimming, and everyone gets a chance to do it. And I'm always really delighted when I get someone in class who comes back and says, you know, we didn't kill those roses. They look great. Yes? The iceberg roses are, if I'm thinking of the same thing you are shrub roses, and white shrub roses, and they don't get trimmed. You can. I've been doing very light trimming on my shrub roses just to, you know, make them look a little bit fuller and to encourage them to grow out.
I take them down about 1/3.
Okay. But she takes the shrub roses down by 1/3 in January. So different styles. Another question?
What about potted roses?
What about potted roses?
I've had some in pots for a couple of years, and I noticed the soil is pretty low down, but they're still flowering, so how do I add more soil? Because I don't want to put it on top of it.
Yeah.
I have 50 potted roses
David, why don't you give this lecture? I'm in the wrong spot.
On the pots, what I do when the soil gets low is to have a good root ball. I will lift it up, and I'll put the soil in and make sure that there's good looking roots at the bottom. If the roots look like they've been soaking, and that does happen, then cut off the bad roots, get the soil in there, put it down, and then put a little chaff on the top. That's how we handle our plant.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's what I would have guessed as well, that you pull the plant up and put some soil at the bottom where the growing roots are, and that sort of thing. And in addition, I had really not seen roses grown for years in pots until we did a little field trip to the home of the president of the Desert Rose Society, who has about 300 or 400 roses in his backyard, probably a couple hundred of them in pots, with drippers, and I mean, he must have invested heavily in quarter-inch tubing manufacturers. In any case, it's doable. It's a lot of work. I can't imagine how many hours he spends out there every January, but he also wins prizes at every Rose Society meeting, so whatever.
Would you be able to address the difference between the heirloom roses and our current hybrid as far as the pollen, the bees, difference of protein and nectar?
Can I talk about the difference in the pollen between the wild roses and the hybrid teas?
Between the heirloom, the 50,
Right,
60-year-old.
the old single roses. No. I mean, I just can't. I mean, but I think there are some here who are probably more expert than I in as rosarians. David, you want to take a stab at that?
We have just a few samples of the heirloom roses because they only bloom once. So you get a spring bloom and then you have a lot of growth after that. So I've convinced my wife to limit the number of heirloom roses. But they can be huge, 8 feet across very easily, and they'll grow that quickly in the space of a couple of years.
I'm guessing that part of your question is, are they better for bees than the hybrid tea rose in terms of?
What is the evidence base on the difference of the pollen, the nectar, the production of both?
I have no clue. I have no clue. I haven't studied that. But that would be a terrific project and an outstanding presentation for someone to give if you do student presentations.
We had the butterfly class at the Grow Lab in the farm. They said that the roses with the least petals were better for the bees.
Ah,
Less petals.
so the bees don't have to do as much work to get to the pollen. Yeah. Okay. I guess, how much pollen is in one of the single roses versus the multi flowering hybrid teas, who knows? Interesting question, and seriously worth, it's an interesting area. And if you did something on that and sent down a copy, I would love to read a story about that. Well, it's been fun. You almost didn't get to hear me because my GPS said I was supposed to go another 27 miles south, and I knew that couldn't possibly be true. And by dumb luck, got off at an exit of the 215 and found my way to Meridian Parkway. So anyhow, if you have questions, email me. My email address is on the roster, and it's been fun, and I appreciate all your comments.
Thank you.